Kia ora mate, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you mate for inviting me to say my 6 minutes. And who in this room has ever been able to say no to me? So that's why we're here. In 1993, the former Prime Minister Jim Bolger was ridiculed for suggesting that New Zealand was an Asia-Pacific nation. 21 years later, New Zealand is looking and behaving more like an Asian-Pacific nation than a monocultural one. One of our top female athletes is a young Korean Kiwi called Lydia Ko. Arguably, our best rugby player is a Samoan Kiwi who's also Muslim. Sounds actually poor. Our parliament looks more like the people it represents than ever before. 3 political party leaders are Māori New Zealanders. When we switch on our TVs, we listen to journalists called Ali Ikram, Chris Cheng, Ruwani Pereira. We hear from economists like Ganesh Nana and Shanabeel Yakub. I'm very pleased to meet you. And there is an entire television channel broadcast in Te Reo Māori. Anyone who remembers our Rugby World Cup 2011 opening ceremony would be hard pressed to think we're monocultural. London's Telegraph newspaper said, at its heart was a defining cultural pivot around which the entire event would spin. What was clear to the world that there is no nation on earth quite like Aotearoa New Zealand, and what's great is that finally we too are embracing our uniqueness. Young Māori and Pacific Kiwis are a growing demographic, speaking their own languages and studying in tertiary institutions more than ever before. Today, 1 in 10 Kiwis are also Asian Kiwis. Here in Auckland, 1 in 4 of us are Asian. While recent growth is rapid, let us remember that Asian people aren't just recent arrivals. The first Chinese arrived here before the treaty was signed. The first Muslim and Indian Kiwis were working and living here 140 years ago. In rural and provincial centres, which has got a bit of a mention today, from Auckland to Gisborne, Hamilton to Levin, Carterton to Dunedin, you will find the footsteps, families and businesses of generations of Asian New Zealanders. Generations of Asian New Zealanders helped build this country, and as Asian New Zealanders are people who are literally helping to rebuild Christchurch. Migrant workers, many coming from across Asia, form the backbone of the rebuild, and Asian companies are working alongside locals and investing millions in the Christchurch rebuild. As a small, geographically isolated economy, New Zealand needs to be savvy, strategic and sensible if we're going to punch above our weight in the global economy. And yet, there's a few things we need to get clear if we want to succeed. As you all know, and I'm no economist, the global economy doesn't just speak English. The global economy just doesn't include one race of people. And crucially, the global economy's centre of gravity is now unquestionably Asian. Global entrepreneur and philanthropist Li Ka-shing's Confucian philosophy says, a company's and a country's most valuable asset of all cannot be found on a balance sheet. The most valuable assets of all are intangible and eternal. Li Ka-shing says success with integrity, and I say here in New Zealand, success with mana. This is the kind of wisdom that will help future-proof our economy and our country for future generations of New Zealanders. I've met with successful business leaders from across the region, and they say evidence shows a diverse workforce significantly enhances business performance. Instead of a single, standardised perspective, diversity gives you a different perspective. Diversity can give you that edge that no one else has. If we are to be taken seriously in Asia, we need to look at Asia not just as a potential market to make profit out of. We need to understand and form relationships with Asian peoples in our own country and overseas. Chinese Kiwi Sean Kam grew up in Takapuna, where he played rugby for Westlake Boys, and he was known as the Orient Express. Sean's also a bit of a financial whiz kid, a CFO of one of New Zealand's top 50 listed companies. He says Kiwi companies are missing out on the diversity stakes at both board and senior management level. He knows firsthand that Asian Kiwis can and do bridge the cultural gap. Companies face when doing business because Asian Kiwis like him understand both sets of cultures. Diversifying the boardrooms of New Zealand companies, not just their workforce, is a challenge our businesses need to meet. Diversity in business can take on many forms. Last year at the Taniwha and Dragon Festival, Māori and Chinese leaders celebrated and forged cultural, ancestral, historical and economic bonds. If New Zealand is going to be a true innovation nation, we need to celebrate and plan for the reality that we are fast becoming one of the most ethnically diverse nations on earth. 1 in 10 Kiwis are Asian Kiwis. 1 in 4 Aucklanders are Asian Aucklanders. This is the changing face of New Zealand. But does the changing face of New Zealand have a voice? Or is the changing face of New Zealand a silent face? Only 5 MPs in the New Zealand Parliament are Asian Kiwis. The State Services Commission lists 1 Asian CEO in an acting role. Getting more Asians into positions of power, corporate, social and political positions of power and leadership isn't just about getting excellent grades or being excellent at what you do. Kiwis from Asian backgrounds remain underrepresented in senior management, public and private sector, despite outstanding qualifications. If we want the people in this room on the boards of our private sector companies, heading our government departments, or sitting in cabinet alongside John Key, and I did have David Cumberford in here, whoever that may be, it won't be made chair, will it, mate? Then things need to change. We all have our roles to play in this change. 48 hours after this year's general election, our Prime Minister said he wanted to lead a government that will govern for all New Zealanders. He wants a New Zealand that's a more confident, more outward-looking, multicultural New Zealand. The reality is that the challenge for our nation to be more confident, outward-looking and multicultural is a challenge for all of us to take on. The State Services Commission, when they're selecting the next public sector CEO, the partners of our biggest law firm when they're deciding on their new partner, from the political parties deciding on the election candidates, to the board of our biggest listed companies when they advertise a board vacancy. The face of New Zealand is changing every day. Whether or not the changing face of New Zealand is reflected everywhere is a challenge for all New Zealanders to take up. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou.